Welcome back, or welcome to another episode of the New Levels Coaching Podcast. Remember, we are the endurance podcast that brings you lots of inspiration, education from the coaching world, and a few exciting announcements to kick us off before I go into this week's episode. Firstly, we have just launched the brand new Paula Radcliffe Marathon Workshop. That's the first ever. That'll be in January of 2025. We are looking forward to that. You can find out all details about that on our website. And secondly, I'm proud to say that we have a sponsor of the podcast. We have partnered with Sunto. Very big thanks to Dan, who's one of our NLC athletes who we've been working with to get that deal over the line. Sunto are going to be a very proud sponsor of the NLC podcast, and we can't wait to promote them as a brand. And to kick things off, we are going to have Dan or the Sunto team on with us for a podcast recording very, very soon. So watch this space. This week, though, is all about transition. Transitions fall into it, I suppose.
Good start.
A bit of a pun thrown in there, because I'm joined by NLC athlete Jamie Wright. We've been doing some NLC coaches stories and some NLC athlete stories over the past few months. So I've kindly asked Jamie to come into the podcast studio, which he has done.
Reluctantly. He's talking about himself, but nice to be here. Thanks.
But Jamie is an athlete who I've worked with in the past, and the reason I wanted to bring Jamie on is because he demonstrates how dynamic our coaching team is, really, because I've worked with him as a runner, and then when Jamie wanted to go to triathlon, we decided that he'd be better fit to work with Kirsty, who's our head of triathlon coaching here at NLC. I am not a triathlon coach. I don't claim to be, and I'm not the best of swimmers, so that wouldn't have been a good fit. So Jamie has been working with Kirsty more closely recently and has had some exceptional performances. So I thought it'd be a good idea to bring him into the podcast studio to chat about that transition between coaches, and also to give people an insight into the endurance world as a whole. So not just from a running perspective, but also triathlon, because I know a lot of people do now cross over between the two. So no better person than somebody who's done it in real life, rather than me just talk about it and claim to know about it. So with that in mind, Jamie, welcome to the pod.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I'm going to kick off, as always, by asking, we are the endurance podcast that brings inspiration to the endurance world. Who inspired you to get into sport at maybe at a young age or even more recently?
Yeah, very much at a young age. My dad was a very good sportsman. Interestingly, he was actually very good at racket sports, which I've always been terrible at, but always as a kid. Yeah, he was very much encouraging. So I would play hockey on a Saturday, Sunday morning would be rugby, Sunday afternoon off to football. There's a group of us in our school class who always, I would say we were always good at all sports, but I was certainly a master of none, but very much in the kind of school team. So yeah, it was inspiration from him. He was always very much allowing us to get close to beating him, but would never actually let us beat him, which actually was always that great motivation. I've always wanted to kind of do better, wanted to play again, knowing that you'd never quite beat him at a racket sport, but it was good. It's
an interesting parents' approach, isn't it? I always remember my dad saying to me, the minute you beat me in running is the minute I stop. Yeah. So good encouragement to be better than them, but also at the same time, it's like, why did you ever stop, Dad? You kept into it. We've obviously played golf together.
Yes,
one of the other sports that you say you're a master of none, but you're pretty good at a lot of sports, Jamie, and you're very competitive as well.
Again, it's all relative, isn't it? And I think the one thing that I've learned through this process is, it's all very easy to compare yourself to others, and there'll always be someone, unless you're an absolute top pro, there is always someone better than you, and it's actually very hard to kind of, as you say, find that level and say, do you know what, I'm competitive against myself, and as you say, and that's ultimately what I've always wanted to do, is just continue to, be better, whether that is, golf, and you've got that very much handicap, whether it's running, you've got a PB to aim for, that's always been the kind of thing, because you can always strive to be that bit better against yourself. But if you start comparing yourself to others, that's where you very, very quickly fall off.
Gemma's going to love that as a kick-off. I hope she listens back to it. She always says comparison is the thief of joy. Once you start comparing to other people, that's often when you stop the enjoyment factor of doing the thing that we very much love. So where I'm going to start then is your background. I always think it's a really good place for our listeners and viewers to get a bit more of an understanding of who you are, where you come from, and how you got into sport. So we were mentioning off air that obviously your dad helped with getting you into sport. Was it running from a young age, or what was that first sport when you mentioned a couple of them at school? What was the one that you really liked?
I think it was. It was the athletics, certainly in the summer. But as I said earlier, I genuinely played pretty much everything. I would try my hand at everything. I think the one thing, there was a couple of people at school who were very, very good at sports and probably better than me, all of them. But the one thing that I did find quite early on was actually going up 400, 800 metres cross country. They were the things that I actually won at school. Whereas pretty much everything else I was close but never quite there. So yeah, I would say there was a few bits of school. I was a bit of a show-off. I'd always struggle on the first 400 of an 800, and for some bizarre reason at school I decided to take my top off on the second lap, sprint round and win, and it was the most cringeworthy thing now that I can think of, but I did it about 3 years in a row to win the 800 metres. It was just, yeah, it's horrific when you think back, but yeah, it was very much that kind of, middle distance. And believe it or not, I was actually a county pole vault champion. I was the only person who entered, having tried it in the... I think it was the decathlon the day before. Having never tried it, someone taught me how to do it. Turned up on the Saturday to try that out. Only person entered. Was beaten hands down by the person in the age group below, but technically I was county pole vault champion. So yeah, that's my claim to fame.
You've kept that one quiet. I never knew that when you came to NLC. You didn't mention that one when I was doing our initial, well, it wasn't an initial call. I remember we met in Bom Bom.
We did indeed.
Over at Holywell Drive. Our office is now in another one of the Bom Boms here in Loughborough, or certainly next to it. So pole vault, mixed skills, middle distance. You wouldn't get away with taking your top off now, I don't think, would you? Not in a school race.
And certainly not in a triathlon. If you do anything wrong like that, not even allowed to unzip your top. So yeah, it was it's one of those moments I'll never get back, and it's pretty horrible, but hey, it happened.
Create some good memories though, and hopefully a lot of people haven't forgotten either. They might mention you to this day. Do you remember Jamie Wright, the guy who used to take his top off in those 800 metre races?
My brother certainly doesn't let me forget that one. He was in the same school at the time in the first year I did it, so yeah, I don't think I'll ever live that one down.
I'll have to dig some footage out of that. I'm surprised it wasn't played at your wedding. That'd have been a good one. So obviously getting into sports at a young age and a mix of sports, which is interesting because that's kind of the model, or certainly the method that England Athletics promote from a coaching perspective. They encourage youngsters to try a number of different sports rather than become one specialism early on. They say that being in a going with a multi-sport approach gives people a lot of different skills and attributes which they can then apply to sport later in life when they do choose to specialise. I'm not sure where I sit on that, because I don't think there is a problem with people specialising either. If you look at the Kenyan model, for example, they very much specialise from an early age and they have huge success. But then we do see a lot of burnout, especially in this country, with children who've maybe been pushed a little bit too hard. But it sounds like you had a pretty nice balance of trying a lot of different sports.
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, every day of the week, 3 lots of sport at the weekend. And I've tried to continue that. I've always, tried to, play a little bit of five-a-side a few years ago. I've now given that up, having pulled the hamstring a couple of times doing that, and deciding it probably wasn't the best combination with triathlon. But it's the first thing I look at in the morning is BBC Sport. The last thing I look at night is BBC Sport. I'm absolutely fascinated by anything. I'll watch anything. I'll play anything. And that's, it's very much a big part of my life and a big part of my interest.
Well, I know as well, a big part of your life is your wife now, Bex, and she's very active, and you spend a lot of time with active holidays as well. And it's not just, the running, the triathlon. You're both big on sport in general and as competitive as each other, I believe.
Yes, yeah. She doesn't. She doesn't like it when I win, but equally, no. She's probably a better natural sportsman than I am. She doesn't enjoy. I've asked her about doing a marathon before. She says, she won't run on demand. But equally, if there's a Garmin badge for a 10 mile, having not run for 3 months, she'll go and bash out 10 miles at 8-minute miles. No problems. Her natural fitness is, pretty phenomenal. But as you say, holidays, weekends, we rarely sit down. Whether it's picking up a kayak on a holiday, a dinghy boat, we always take out the so-called Boris bikes on holiday. I'll go out for my run. She'll follow me around. But yeah, very much. Pretty much never sit down. Might get an hour on the sofa in an evening, but yeah, that's a big part of our lives together, which is great actually to be able to do it together.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, I know from experience as well of doing that with my wife Gemma. We spend a lot of our holidays. Doesn't really feel like a holiday, but it is holiday, isn't it? If that's what you like doing, so
yeah, absolutely.
It's just an active holiday. We'll touch on as well how you combine that with work-life balance as well, because I know you're a very busy workman and you've taken time to come in today, which I really, really appreciate. But I've always admired how you do fit everything in and you get that balance. But I guess if we backtrack to the start of when you joined NLC, I remember a couple of things that stood out for me. One, you mentioned Bex early on and said, oh, she's much more talented than I am. She can get away without training and just kind of get back into it and she can perform really well. Whereas you said to me that you feel like you need to train quite a lot in order to get the best out of yourself. And the first thing I looked at as a coach was actually, could we strip this back a little bit and be a little bit smarter with the training? And this is when we were purely focusing on the running side of things. But we did have some cycling in there and gym still in the program. So when you came to NLC, you joined, and if I remember rightly, I'm going to put myself on the spot here, I think you had an ambition of breaking 40 minutes for 10K was one of the big ones.
Yep.
And eventually, potentially going 3 hours for a marathon. But your marathon PB at the time had been a bit of a disaster. Have I got that right?
Yes, yeah. My first marathon, I did London in 2007. I took a charity place. On the way, I hadn't trained enough, so I should probably state that at the outset before I make my excuses. However, on the morning, we got stuck on the Dockland Light Railway. Had to then track all the way back into London and literally missed the start. So the whole big start of the marathon, I literally walked over the starting line with no one around. It was completely deserted. Me and a friend did it together. Set off, obviously at the back of all of the fancy dress, spent the first half picking my way through, going far too hard, thinking I've got to make up time. Bonkers, really, when you think about the logic on that one. But hey, got to about 20 miles and absolutely, tanked. Was on the floor, people massaging my legs, and I pretty much walked from there. And finished in 4 hours and 11 minutes. So, I was starting with plenty to go at.
So 4 hours and 11 minutes, cramp set in. Was that what you were feeling? Yeah,
I'd just clearly gone far too hard. I think I did the first. I mean, I was never on for anywhere close to 3 at that point. I was looking to break 4 at that point was my aim. But I think I went out in the first. I think it was about 1:31 for the first half, which clearly was unsustainable and very much paid the price.
Was that a half marathon PB at the time?
It would have been, yeah. I don't think I'd ever done even a kind of formal race as a half marathon. At school I was doing cross country, etc., and never really kept up with the running whilst it was part of a general fitness of playing. So I played hockey at uni, so it was part of a general fitness, but it was the first time I'd ever really done any kind of distance. Certainly my training hadn't taken me above the kind of so-called goal of your 20-mile long run. That never happened.
Love it. There'll be a lot of people can relate to this as well. This is why I want to bring more athletes onto the podcast, because it's all well and good as coaches sitting here and talking about our experiences in sport, but sometimes it's better to have people sat here who they can relate to, and everybody's been there, right? I remember I got into running at a young age, but still made similar mistakes, undertrained, went to a race, went out too hard, all those things. But to hear it firsthand from somebody who now runs at a very competitive level, to think you rocked up at London Marathon, firstly missed the start, like there's one mistake, but these things happen. Then obviously then you think, right, I need to get back that time. Again, there'll be people out there who've done the same. Little things about weaving through as well. I bet that was costing you time and effort and energy.
Huge amounts of effort, as you say. And literally when you think about some of the fancy dress, when you've got 7 people connected to each other trying to run along you're literally running almost twice as far to get around them. And the energy to them, the short bursts. I mean, I can remember it now. It was just horrific.
So a horrific marathon experience to start, and we had that conversation. It wasn't a massive conversation around the marathon to start with, was it? It was more kind of 5K, 10K, if I remember rightly.
Yeah, and again, I mean, some of my motivation, again, without bleeding too much. I mean, so having said my dad was a very keen sportsman, he got into business, late 20s, and basically ballooned in weight. And that was always my thing, is I actually looked quite similar to him when he was young.
Right.
So a lot of this for me was actually just about maintaining just general life fitness, keeping the weight down. So one of the initial things of wanting to keep up the running was actually, it was a good way of just keeping out and doing something to keep the weight off. I was obviously getting into, I was relatively new in a job at the time. Yes, becoming very, very busy, and then to wanting that structure around making sure I could actually get out the door and do something.
So we had that as well. I remember that conversation, and I remember you saying, like, I'm not addicted to exercise, but it's a big part of my life, and I need it to be, because I want to feel active, want to feel healthy, and that's, and I think it's really important to say that to a coach when you first start, and it was really important for me to have that understanding. I guess putting my coaching hat on here, and what I looked at, the first thing I remember so vividly was thinking, how have you not raced faster? Not how have you not ran faster, is how have you not raced faster? Because I looked at some of the training stats that you were putting out, and it just didn't make sense. I was thinking, wow, he can train fast, but he's not necessarily translating that into races. So this was a classic example. And again, there'll be a lot of people out there who can relate to this, but there might be people who fall into this category currently, where they do think that they have to run hard or train hard pretty much all the time. And I think it's fair to say you are probably falling into that trap a little bit too much, especially, say, easy runs falling into that more steady run or even tempo run category. Yeah,
definitely. Again, it goes back to that comparing yourself to others, doesn't it? And I think the whole Strava effect of, you've always got to you go for a slow run and you feel as though you've got to justify as to why it was slow and that it was okay to be slow. And I think it's partly always overestimating. And the one thing that I do an awful lot more now is effectively try and train more to heart rate, because actually it's effort. And you talk about that a lot around, actually it's effort. No one's looking at the watch. Your lungs don't know, etc. And I think certainly tempos. Chasing a certain pace, and actually some days it's harder. You come back and you go, that clearly wasn't tempo. I could not. And I think you described it once as saying a good tempo is where you get to the end, and if the coach then says, now do another mile, you can carry on at that same pace. And the number of times I would be absolutely dead on my feet coming off tempo, I was racing as hard as a race, and I'm probably still not great at it, but it's certainly something I'm more conscious of now.
Yeah, I noticed an improvement when I was working with you, and just that, I think it's really hard for people when they first go into tempo running, because it's, let's say, for example, I'm setting you a 45-minute tempo, and you've got to sustain that effort for 45 minutes. At the start of that 45 minutes, you're probably quite confident, I can sustain this. But then by the time you get to 30, you're thinking, oh God, this is pretty hard now. By the time you get to 40, you're thinking, oh God, this is really hard. And again, we've all been there. It takes definitely an element of learning, and there is a learning journey that people have to go on with that. But I do think, it's important to emphasize here that when you did make those changes, we did start to see improvements. It was that classic case of, can we slow some things down in order for you to get better? Now, that doesn't mean slow everything down, because there was also certain sessions where I was then saying, okay, because we've slowed that down, you could go to now a higher intensity on those other sessions. But we definitely started to see an improvement in the races, and those PBs slowly started to come down and chip away. I'm going to fast forward to the marathon, because I think for me that's still one of my favourite ever stories with you. I remember on the roads of Manchester Marathon, I'd come to watch, and I was still coaching at the time, and I saw you, I'd seen you a few times, but I saw you around about 19 miles, somewhere around there on course, and you'd not been having a good day, but you weren't very well going into it, if I remember rightly. You'd had a bit of an illness.
Yeah, I think I'd been feeling a little bit under the weather, but and I'd bizarrely gone into the whole thing not really having any real expectations, and the day before, I think I think there was the cross country or the road race in Sutton Park.
That's right.
And Justin had come round, and someone mentioned the concept of qualifying for Boston and what was the Boston qualifying time, and all of a sudden, 24 hours out, I now had a goal for the marathon, which was, okay, I'm going to try and go for 3 hours. As ever, how often do we talk about the negative split? But that was it. I'd now got this target of going 3 hours, and I ultimately, was feeling under the weather. Went out too hard, shock. But even right from the outset, my heart rate was just really high. I struggled from the outset, but I was determined that it was okay. I'd push through. As you say, I got to 18, 19 miles again, and really struggled. I think from memory, I think I still got around in 3:11. So,
Yeah.
3:11. Yeah, I think it was something along those lines.
And I remember you saying to me, you shut it down at about 16, you realised it wasn't there, and you said, right, actually, I'm just going to jog this in now, and jog, obviously relative terms, but relative to you. So you slowed down, you consciously backed off. But that's where that heart rate data was so valuable. I'm not a huge fan of people wearing heart rates for racing because I think it can be elevated on a race day. But we made the decision that day that it was a good idea to put it on. And it did give us the information. Within the first 6 miles, the heart rate was as if you were on within a session, not doing a marathon. So it was glaringly obvious that something still wasn't right. So it was certainly outside of 3:10 in Manchester. And then we had the conversation, and you'd mentioned that you'd entered another marathon that was coming up very quickly afterwards.
Yeah, it was the impact of COVID. So pre-COVID, I'd signed up for Paris Marathon. And then when the marathons are then obviously rescheduled, it was Paris the weekend after Manchester. So, yeah, we had a conversation, obviously having come off a disappointing result. We kind of said, well, go out to Paris, enjoy it, have a nice weekend. It was Beck's 40th birthday at the time. That same weekend, so let's go to Paris. It'd be a great idea. Which, in fairness to her, she was very much up for. But yeah, it was one of those bizarre days where everything just clicked, felt great. And actually, because of the week before, I did go out significantly easier. I went out, significantly slower than the week before. Very much negative split. Felt great all the way around. Pushed around and I finished in 2:58. 51 or something along those lines. Not that I remember, honest. Very precise there. And then got my Boston qualifying time, and it was coming up towards probably about 2 miles out. There was Beck, who'd followed me around on, again, one of the Boris bikes. She'd literally been following around the marathon, screaming at me that actually just hang on, because actually I was on track for the Boston qualifying time, and she was very, very keen to go out to Boston. And she actually worked out there when she was in practice. So yeah, she was very much looking forward to going back out to Boston. So yeah, it was a great moment, actually. Nice.
And your holidays very much for a period of time revolved around those marathons, because I remember being in conversations with Bex, following you around numerous marathons. Venice, I remember well as Venice, well. Yeah, but it's a good way of doing it, isn't it? I always say to people, if you can see the world whilst doing something that you love, then why not? And she is like chief supporter for you, which is amazing. So Paris, let's unpick that a little bit. So just to enlighten the viewers and listeners here, it was a week out from Manchester, which you mentioned. We didn't do much at all between the two marathons. I think there's a couple of easy jogs and maybe some strides in there.
Yep.
And my theory on that was the work was done, the work was in the bank. You just actually needed to get fresh, and you needed to be recovered from whatever illness was still slightly in there. So you'd had a bit of downtime into Manchester, so we were quite confident that it was almost gone. Manchester showed us that it wasn't quite gone, but you didn't go to the well in Manchester. You kind of switched off a little after halfway, I'd say. So we were confident that, you'd not done too much damage there. But the strategy in Paris was still very much, let's just go and see how you feel. And I remember you went out around 7s to 7-10 minute miling,
yep.
Which for those of you who maybe don't have an understanding of pace, that is well outside of 3 hour pace. It's closer to kind of 3:05 pace, 3:07. So you obviously started to feel good, and then you progressed, and you did do a classic negative split, and you got that time sub 3 hours. But I think the biggest thing here is not just physically, you were physically in shape, but you'd mentally taken the pressure off yourself as well. And I think that played a massive factor in my mind.
Yeah, it's huge. And obviously when we come on to talk about triathlon, I think that is one of the hard things. The more you do, the more pressure you put on yourself. Even as a very much amateur athlete, there's constantly, to say, as much as you want to go for the next PB, sometimes you put too much pressure on yourself, and then you worry, and then you don't sleep, and then actually it becomes this really negative cycle. And at that point, you stop enjoying it, and actually sometimes just say, complete pressure off. Yeah, it was great. And I mean, the whole weekend, actually, we got engaged on the day after, which is obviously obviously a nice way. I'm not sure I was still euphoric on my sub 3. So yeah, it was just everything about that weekend was genuinely perfect.
Amazing. So a nice end to a really good story, and a Boston Qualifier when it was unexpected, an engagement thrown in there as well in a really nice city to do that in, and then obviously Bex gets to go back to Boston as well with you, which you did go to as well with some of the NLC athletes out there at the same time, which was great, and numerous other races thrown in the mix there as well between Boston, and PBs again continued to fall from a running perspective. And during that time, you'd mentioned a few times, because I don't just want to say that you then became a triathlete, because you had done some triathlons. Even when you were with me, you did a couple of sprints, I think, and you'd already dabbled in that triathlon scene, if I remember rightly, even before you came to me.
Yes, yeah, my brother took up triathlon probably a couple of years before I kind of gave it a go. And actually he took to it. He was great, despite the fact his swimming isn't particularly strong. He did very, very well. And actually I kind of looked at that and went, well, hang on a second. The one thing that I was pretty good at as a kid was actually swimming. We didn't talk about that earlier. Actually, I should swim. I was like, hang on a second. I've obviously got this running background now. I'm doing an awful lot of running. I can swim. Haven't got a road bike. Never been on a bike. Okay, I did a paper round as a kid. I could technically ride a bike. So that was the kind of daunting bit for me, was that. But other than that, I was like, let's give this a go.
So again, it comes back to that family relationship, like dad getting you into sports as a youngster, and then obviously brothers even encouraging each other, a bit of healthy competition there between yourself and your brother.
There isn't. I guess I think there's always that with a sibling, in terms of you kind of want to see that competitiveness, but equally we weren't particularly competitive as kids, because actually he wasn't sporty in the slightest as a kid, and I don't think he's ever seen me as competition. In I think he's always kind of resigned to the fact that he thought I would win, whereas I'm actually completely opposite now, as I genuinely think he's much stronger on the bike, and actually his running's really come on. So I think he's certainly gone sub 130 for his half, and he's
nice.
Pretty much, I think he's low threes in his marathon now. So he is now genuinely much better at biking. And if he could swim, he would absolutely thrash me. So, but there's never quite been that competitiveness. It's a genuine interest, because I want him to do well. He wants me to do well, and that's actually quite a nice way of going at it with a sibling. Because that's, as kids, we were at each other's throats. We were almost too close in age, so we'd fight all the time.
Yeah,
and actually it's one of the things that we would So my first triathlon was with him. Over in Ludlow, and again he really supported me and encouraged me to get into this, and I think partly because he could see that he felt as I'd be able to do it and be half decent at it. So it was really good.
We mature eventually, don't we? As kids, we're all competitive and at each other's throats and things, and then that's always been my take on running in general, whether it's a sibling, whether it's a friend, whether it's just competitors. It's a bit of a weird mentality, I guess, but I think it is a good one. I'm not really bothered how other people do if they beat me. I just want people to do well, because I'm in control of what I can do. And if I do as well as I can do, then I'm happy. And if somebody beats me, that's fair enough. You just got to hold your hands up and say, well, they beat me on the day, so I still did well. So I was always like comparing myself to myself, back to your original point. If I felt like I'd perform well, then why should I be bothered about anybody else? I cared for other people and I wanted them to do well, absolutely. And when I was on the track, certainly I was a fierce competitor. I wanted to win, but at the same time, I think a lot of people get too dragged into, like you said originally, comparing themselves to other people and being affected by what other people do. And I think that's a dangerous game, certainly a dangerous line to go down. So we had a conversation then around triathlon. You'd mentioned, I might dabble a bit more with triathlon. We certainly thought there was a bit of potential there. And you thought about, going to what you'd classify as like the age group stuff, as people say, the age group. And I mentioned that Kirsty would be a better fit at NLC than I, because I don't know much about that environment at all. And I wasn't willing to go down that environment either. It would have taken a lot of time and a lot of learning. And I wasn't prepared to go in a pool and tell somebody how to swim when I can't swim myself. I can swim, but I'm not the greatest. So we felt it was a better idea for you to have that conversation with Kirsty. But what were your thoughts around going into that world and transitioning across and giving it more of a go, I guess, would be the phrase I'm looking for?
Oh, there's a question. I think it was exciting. As you say, I felt as though I'd achieved what I wanted to achieve in terms of the marathon. As you say, having got that time, that was, I never felt as I could necessarily better it. I certainly wasn't going to set a target of 2:45 or 2:50 because I genuinely felt as though I'm getting older, unfortunately, and I felt as though I'd hit that limit. So it was very much exciting, new challenge, and interesting. The age group stuff actually came slightly afterwards. So the first triathlon I did was a sprint triathlon over in Ludlow with my brother, and one of his friends had previously qualified for the age group, and I can't remember whether I beat him, but I was certainly pretty close to him and thought, hang on a second, I'd not really heard of this, but this sounds great, being able to represent GB.
Yeah.
Something as I said earlier, I always saw myself as good at sport, but never actually. All of a sudden, this is exciting. If I can get a GB vest, why not? And that's the point where I kind of went, that's what I want to achieve. And obviously, we then took it further, as you say, transferred across to Kirsty. So really put some focus on what I could do.
So when you then transitioned across, the training focus, because you still used to cycle when I was coaching you as a bit of an aerobic top-up, and it's an easy way to offload the body while still getting some cardiovascular fitness in there, which is great. You were always reluctant to swim. I always remember that about you. Even if I put it in there, you'd be like, I didn't swim tonight, so I did a bike instead. But obviously the training focus then would have slightly shifted, I'd imagine. And you then focusing on those 3 disciplines a little bit more than just specialising in the running. But I'm always intrigued with this is how do people fit it in? Because it's a lot of time, isn't it? How are you balancing that with your life? Because I think a lot of people will be in a similar position here, especially if they're thinking about going to triathlon.
I think it is one of the challenges. And I'm probably quite obsessive, so I make time, and it is about being flexible. So if I'm busy at work, it may well be that I go out at 10 o'clock at night and fit it around life, and that is hard. Equally, it is keeping up to date with Kirsty and saying, actually, look, I haven't got time to do this here. What can we do? Shifting things around and being flexible, and that's the great thing. I do think at times the weekends are tough. So the one day that I would generally have as a rest day historically was a Saturday, whereas now all of a sudden a Saturday is a long bike, which could be up to 3 hours, which I generally probably stick to 1.5 to 2. Again, just on time.
Yeah.
And then Sunday long run still remains, albeit the long run having not doing the marathon now is probably 12, 13 miles. You're still, as you say, looking at a big commitment.
Yeah.
I'm not great in the mornings. In an ideal world, you'd probably get up early, and I do look at people when I kind of roll out of bed and I see these people who've already gone out and done their 20 miles in the morning. I think, I think that'd be great, wouldn't it? But it is a commitment, but equally, for me, I genuinely enjoy being active, as we said earlier, and especially if you can include, obviously I can include back in that. That's great. I think sometimes, I have been known to be sat on the bike in the shed, reading a document from work. There are ways of doing it. It's obviously not ideal to be sweating on legal papers or documents, but I think if you've got that mindset, you can always find some time. But equally, and the one thing that I'm still bad at is, I was away last weekend, so I missed Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And you always tell me you can never make it up. And yet I'm still determined, I missed Friday, so why don't I just have this, I'll find time to do a run and a bike, and I think we're all guilty of worrying about missing, but actually, as we all know, it doesn't really make that much difference.
There's a couple of points that I want to touch on there. The first one being that exact thing you've just mentioned, and it's classic, isn't it? I want to make up for what I've lost. And I always say to people, don't fall into that trap. It's a dangerous game, because what happens is you then create overload the following week, and that is then a high risk strategy and often leads to either injury or burnout. The reason I'm big on that, and I said don't try and catch it up, is because training for me is like a continuum, and it's about being consistent over a period of time, not trying to hit stats in just 1 week. And you see it, the classic is how many miles have I done this week, how many hours have I done this week, and if people see a drop off from that, they then get a little bit nervous and think, oh God, I'm going to get unfit. You won't get unfit from that. But what you will get unfit from is if you then try and catch that up and overload, then become injured or fatigued, and then you can't train, and then you have to spend weeks out. So I always look at training as a continuum and a continuum cycle to say, have you got enough training in that block of training as opposed to just that short period of time? And I think when you look at it with a kind of a wider lens, it often gives people a little bit more confidence to say, well, actually, I've still done like 95% of the training here. You know, you've probably never missed something for like 5 or 6 weeks, maybe even longer than that. So actually, you've missed 3 things in a period of, I don't know, 2 months. It's not much, is it really? So yeah, I think that's point number 1. Point number 2 was around when you mentioned, and I've got to pick my brains here as to how to word this, but you mentioned there that you will get work done if you're on the bike, like you're looking at your work whilst on the bike, you're combating 2 things and you want to do those things. I'm a big fan of the phrase, people will find an excuse if they don't want to do something, but they will find an excuse also if they want to do something. So they'll find an excuse not to do it and they'll say, oh, sorry, I ran out of time. It's actually, really, if you delve deep into that, it's probably because they just couldn't be asked. Whereas if somebody really wants to do something, they'll find any excuse to do it, which is a good example here of you saying, you know what, I can read something whilst I'm on the bike. I'm still going to do it. And I know you're a good example of that. But there also is a fine balance, isn't there? And that's what I want to get across to the audience. Like, sometimes it's fine to go out and do a jog at 10 o'clock at night if you're recovering on the side of it. But if that becomes like a regular occurrence, obviously we could risk not having the right recovery. And it is a fine balance. So how do you get that balance with you? So how do you know when it's probably a bit too much?
I think the one thing, having been effectively coached for quite a number of years now, I think you do learn your body. You know, when you genuinely feel it before you go out, you just know some days, or you're a mile in and it's just hard. And that's the day you say, actually, I'm not going to benefit from doing 6-7 miles here. I am going to cut it down. And again, I'm not professing to be great at this, but you genuinely do know. And I do make changes on that basis. And, I hate it if you have a session, probably abandon 3 or 4 sessions in a number of years and you feel horrible. But there's no point, there's no benefit from pushing your body, and you know that. Yeah. And I think that's the one thing you do. The more you do, the more you learn that. Yeah,
I couldn't agree more. I had a session just a couple of weeks ago where it just wasn't right, and you just know, don't you? You can feel it. And in the end, I just thought, I'm not going to do that last 20-minute rep. I'm just going to step off. And I was out with a couple of other athletes. I thought I'm going to get warm and support them, and go home and recover. And turns out I came down with an illness a couple of days later. You generally sense things, and there's certain signs. You mentioned heart rate as well, could be a good indication, but there's no better feeling than the feel and perception of what you are feeling. So trust your judgment at times, because I think sometimes that's the best weapon you've got, and it's the best understanding you'll have is you and your own body. So you're combining all this training now with triathlon, and you're managing to fit everything in, and then you decide, okay, or how do you decide? Do you decide? Is it the same process that you have with me, where we sit down and we look at the race calendar and where you might want to race? How do you pick those events, and certainly the big ones, because they are big, aren't they, in the triathlon domain?
Yeah, I think as I say, starts with that goal setting. I mean, the one thing on the runners retreat in Morsey, that's one thing I took away from that, was actually about having clear goals. What do you actually want to achieve? Sitting down and thinking about that. And again, that was one of the things I said there was about the age group qualifications, so going for European standard distance triathlon. So again, the race calendar was effectively based around that. There was a couple of qualifying events I wanted to do on that basis, and there was a couple of additional races. There was always one in Sutton Park, which is literally 100 yards away from my door, which always feels a natural one to want to participate in, despite the fact that the road surface is terrible, and it's actually quite a tough bike course, but it's an obvious one for me to do. And equally, I still wanted to keep in the odd running race, just to see where I'm at. And I think that's always a good gauge for me. The one thing about triathlon is obviously the courses are completely different. Sometimes they run long, sometimes they run short. So actually comparing a time on any given course, it's similar to a 10K, but actually I think there's probably a lot more variability in there. You can't pick a flat one. So actually it's some of the race picking is around the qualification, but equally every now and again you want to pick a small local one because you think you might be able to do a bit better. It gives you that ego boost to say, actually, I've done well in this one.
Sounds a little bit like trail racing in that respect, where I look certainly as a coach at which courses might suit my athletes as well, because they're very different, and different in distances, they're different in terrain, and I think I was watching the the Nice one that weekend where they had the World Ironman champs, and like they were saying, I think it was a really tough bike course with a big hill in there, and like, that's going to suit certain people, but that's not going to suit others. So you've got to be probably smart about where you pick your race as well. So how did you then qualify for your first Europeans? What was that qualification process? What did it look like?
So qualification race was up in Southport, which ironically was a very, very flat bike course up and down the front. And interesting, again, I didn't automatically qualify. So the way that the age group works is effectively there's up to 20 athletes, top 3 in each qualifying race, get automatic qualification. Yeah. And then effectively it's almost like a fastest loser scenario where you then get the additional qualifying spots. So I actually got my notification quite late to go out to Madrid last year. And I kind of was disappointed that it wasn't through automatic qualification. It kind of felt as though I cheated. It was just because other people didn't want to be there that I got there. Went out to Madrid, had a great weekend, great city, really enjoyed it. But I was 12th Brit and 16th overall, which actually overall I was pleased, having almost been the qualifying through the roll down to then say, actually, okay, out of the 20 Brits, I've come 12th. So yeah, I felt there was a sense of satisfaction, but very much then my target last year was about getting that automatic qualifying spot. I really wanted to kind of qualifying in my own right.
And I imagine, again, I'm not the most clued up on triathlon, but I do follow it enough to know that we are a strong nation when it comes to tri. And I imagine that funnels down to the age group as well. I know it's a very popular sport for a lot of people. And when I've been to an airport before, when there's been a champs going on, I see a lot of people. Yeah.
I would say generally it's probably 2/3 of the total athletes. Brits.
Wow.
Yeah. And when you look at the the GB team in the kind of team photo, there's hundreds. Which actually, as you say, it's a real testament to UK triathlon and the work they do in terms of encouraging. Yeah. I think the whole age group system. Some people see it as almost some of the top athletes in terms of people who have been there and almost done it for real, if that makes sense. They almost look down and say, oh, this isn't the same. Well, actually, for someone who is good, but I was never going to be a professional athlete. Actually, it's a great system. It really encourages people to give them something to target towards. It's competitive racing, great like-minded people. It's a really good system.
Yeah, and it doesn't need to be the same either, does it? This is what I always think about it. I was guilty of it. Like years ago, I used to look at the Masters stuff and I used to think, I'll never go into that Masters domain because I'll have finished my career at that point. And then you get to it and you're like, actually, this is a really good system. It keeps people in the sport for longer and it gives people opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. It's just different. It doesn't need to be the same. So I think looking at it from an outside perspective and having my eyes on it, I think it opens up a lot of doors and opportunities for people that wouldn't exist in the normal world. And if people are being competitive and also being healthy and continuing to exercise, then why not? It's just another good incentive to keep people active. So the GB team, I imagine it isn't the easiest to qualify for then because there's that many people doing it.
I think and again, the way the system works is if there's someone who is phenomenally good within your age group, you've still got to finish, I think, within 10-15% of their time. So actually, in essence, it can become quite hard in certain age groups especially. And I actually always look at the kind of 40 to 50 category as almost the most competitive. Because actually often people who have gone away, had kids, done less training and probably not been as focused, almost come back to it. So I always feel as actually you look at some of the younger categories, younger age groups, and there's probably less people in those categories. But I always, whether I'm biased or not, but I think some of those older categories are actually more competitive to qualify.
Well, I'm going to back you up on this because at UTMB this year, I won my category 35 to 40, which is classed as like one of the younger categories. And I would have been beaten by people who were in an older category because you're right. I was there as a bit of fun and that a lot of the people in my age group actually compete in the longer distances as well. So they're still competing because they're at such a high level. Yeah. But then the people who've either gone away or actually decided to drop down, like one of the women in my category beat me. She's a pro. And I was like, yeah, she was smashing it up the hill. I was like trying to stick with her. She was absolutely incredible. But it was like that realization of, that as the age groups go up, that doesn't necessarily mean it gets a lot less competitive. And that 40 to 50, I remember Kirsty saying to me, she was really impressed with your result this year, which we'll go on to in a second, because it is a strong age group, a really strong age group. So you went away and you thought, right, I'm going to try and automatically qualify this time. So how did that play out? What was then the plan of action for this year's qualification?
I mean, I guess I think it was just going back to what I said earlier, having that clear goal, having got there but not got there the way I wanted to. It was the planning. It was looking at the specific races that gave me the opportunity. That was my kind of sole goal almost that year. There was nothing else. That was what I wanted to do. Actually, I'm trying to even remember which race it was, but I remember at the time, going, I knew I was up in. Ironically, I qualified actually from a race where the bike was cancelled, which would have suited me. So it was up in Castle Howard, the Castle Series, which again was a great race, but it was a really wet weekend.
Right.
Roads were flooded. Bike got cancelled. So there was me with my two stronger, the two stronger of the three. So it was again, to an extent, it was almost a qualification. Slightly cheated in terms of not having the bike on there, but I remember being really, really happy that day and going, I raced exactly how I wanted to.
So that, I think, to touch on a point there, which is, again, a lot of people will be able to learn from this in any sport, particularly if we look back at those endurance sports, running, trail running, triathlon. Having big goals often gives us clear direction, and we find that when people over race and try and over compete, it's often when they don't achieve what they want to achieve. You're saying here, like, I had clear goals set out where I wanted to achieve, and that's sometimes what these longer sports do for us. The marathon, we see that a lot with marathon runners. Again, ultra runners, exactly the same, because you can't do as many as, say, like a 5K. But as a 5K runner myself, we used to map out opportunities throughout the year, like where our big races and where we're going to peak. And I think that's a mistake a lot of people fall into, is they don't look at where they're going to peak. But here, it lends itself quite nicely to those big races. So you got the qualification. And then Europeans this year was in a different venue again.
Yeah, so Vichy in France. I'd just come back from 2 weeks of holiday. Obviously, as you said earlier, a lot of the hard work had been done before then, but equally that kind of nervousness of having 2 weeks of not really training fully. Came back for a week, picked up a tiny tweak in my calf just before that, and I think I was always making any excuse because I was worried about having not trained in those last few weeks. But again, going back to what you said earlier, almost took the pressure off in France. So I went there not really expecting anything, wasn't really sure whether I wanted to be there, and raced exactly how I wanted to. Swam well. My bike was good enough. It's never going to be fantastic. But ended up finishing third Brit and top 10, which actually gives me automatic qualification into Istanbul Europeans next year.
Amazing. So it's top 10 overall when you were 16th the year before, but third Brit this time where you were 12th the year before. So a significant improvement from the previous year. It's really interesting because last night we were on a Q&A with Paula Radcliffe, and she said often people find out what their best taper strategy is by mistake, and they learn that they get ill or injured or something in the build-up, and then they realise, actually, I can probably do a bit less than I've been doing here, because they actually freshen up. And that's when we have our best races. And it's so true. I see that a lot where people have had a bit of a minor issue going into a race. They've not been able to do as much as they wanted to do. They get to the race a little bit worried because they think that they might be undercooked, which I never think you can be, and then they smash it out the park, and you look at it and go, maybe I was just super fresh on the day.
Yeah, I think that's, and again, if we think back to the marathon, exactly the same. So my probably two biggest achievements were exactly in that. A, not feeling any pressure, but equally, as you say, having a much lighter week. And most athletes will say the same. You hate tapering because you feel as though you're not being proactive.
Yeah.
You feel as though you want to be doing something. And you guys always say, no, this is the process, trust the process. How many times have you said those words, trust the process? It's really hard to do. But exactly that, when you're almost forced to do it by default, yeah, it's worked well.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Sonia on one of the podcasts, Sonia Samuels, one of our coaches, she described it as peaking. She said, I don't see it as tapering, I see it as peaking. I really like that phrase, just to get, that different mentality on it. But in Chamonix this year, I was stalking people on Strava. I was a bit sad, but I wanted to see what they were doing in the last 2 weeks, and I guess more from a coaching perspective than an athlete. But I was sat there thinking, like, what are you doing with a lot of people? And there was a trend between the people who ran well, and I felt tapered well, and the people who didn't maybe run so well, who were just absolutely smashing it. And you think to yourself, like, why are you doing it at that point in the season? Like, you've got your big goal race coming up. Why are you going out and doing something so big or so hard within like the last 7 to 10 days? So I think a lesson there for everybody is like, trust the taper. Definitely. But also you might find out by mistake that you sometimes benefit from more of a taper than you think. I heard a general rule of thumb recently in a podcast I was listening to. They were saying if it's a 2-week taper, they would suggest dropping volume by 50% in the first week and then another 50% in the second week, which is huge when you look at it like that. Let's say, for example, Jamie's training, 12 hours a week, and then you drop to 6 hours a week, and then you drop to 3, like 3 hours in a week. Like, it's not much. But then, are you then just super fresh for the event on the day? Where, how long was your event in terms of hours on the day as well? It's worth talking about.
2.25 hours-ish.
So you might have only done 3 hours in the week, but then you're close to 3 hours again on the event day. So you then total hours in the week all of a sudden jumps back up because of the event itself. So yeah, it's an interesting philosophy, and I think it's playing around with the taper for a lot of people. But maybe you've found something there as you go forward.
Maybe it's just believing it next time, isn't it? When I'm determined to go out and have a hard week in the week before, but
yeah, and I think it's worth writing down for people like what did work and looking back, and because a lot of it does come down to belief. It's the mindset behind it. If you believe it's going to work, it'll probably work for you. So then, speaking about the future, what is next?
So I've got, other than Istanbul next year, I also decided to drop down the distance. So I went for qualification for the Worlds of Sprint, having not actually been organised, which is a common theme in my world. I didn't realise that the Worlds next year are actually in Wollongong in Australia. So got qualification for that. As much as it'd be great to go to Australia, I think going for kind of an hour's race might be pushing it. But equally, we do love a holiday, so we'll see what next year brings. So
potentially the World Sprint, but definitely the Europeans again, which is Istanbul next year, and then I imagine some key races in the build up as well to that. Any running races? Will I see you again on the roads?
Who knows? I mean, I think I would like to go back and do a marathon at some point, and whether a spring marathon's on the cards. I did do a bit of cross country as a kid. My brother's doing a bit of cross country again this winter, and again he really enjoyed that last year, and I loved it as a kid. So yeah, we'll see. Again, anything to keep me active. Catch up with Coach Kirsty after this. Actually, we'll probably start thinking about some of the challenges for next year. Nice. Well, a good point to end on. A planning session with Coach before when they put together that long-term plan ready for 2025. I would recommend cross country. I didn't love it as a kid. Tell a lie. I liked it as a kid. I then went off it in kind of the middle part of my career. Did it last year. Really enjoyed it. So yeah, I think maybe we'll toe the line together in a Birmingham league. We shall see. Brill. Well, thank you so much for sharing that story, Jamie. Hopefully our viewers and listeners have had a lot to take away from that. In particular, a few highlights for me, especially at the end there, talking about tapering and finding that maybe by mistake, but not being afraid to trust that taper and be super fresh going in. Setting yourself big goals. Like I remember that session so well in Morzine where you said, oh, maybe I don't do this enough, but I'm going to put myself out there. And then not just setting it though, going after it. It's one thing setting a goal, but actually going after it is a whole different ball game. So, fair play to you. You've gone after it, and you're seeing the results because of that. And then finally, you've been coach for a very long time now, and I really like the way you related it to then understanding your body. Like, yes, you're still coach, and you get coach input along the way. But over that period of time, you've learned to understand your body and listen to that. And that would be one of my big take-home messages for people. Listen to your body when you're training. If you need a day off, take a day off. Don't always think more is more, because it isn't always the case.
Brill. Well, thank you for tuning in, and a big thanks to you again, Jamie, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, I'm sure we'll get you on again in the future if you want to come on.
I won't go that far.
We'll certainly have Coach Kirsty on in the future.
Indeed.
But if you are interested in triathlon coaching with NLC, then you can find out all the details on the website. Kirsty, who coaches Jamie, is our NLC head coach of triathlon, and she is currently recruiting for, I believe, another 2 or 3 athletes as she heads into 2025, particularly working with some of those age group triathletes as they head into potentially Istanbul or the Worlds if you fancy Australia. But as always, enjoy your training. Good luck if you are racing, and we'll see you all again very, very soon.